The Sentinel is known to be reliable, fearless, disciplined, consistent, courageous, motivated, and skillful.
So do what you feel passionate about. Take chances.
All these qualities start from the mind. Your mind can be your worst enemy or your most powerful weapon.
The world becomes your library to help you become better at your craft.
Is this the dagger?
Learn how to achieve greatness and tap into the Sentinel mindset.
This episode is brought to you by The Arena. The Arena focuses on helping law enforcement and security professionals achieve their ultimate work experience, curriculum, and fitness goals. Visit thearenatoronto.com.
Good evening, everyone. Super excited. I love using the word excited, as you guys know from season 1. But very, very excited today for a couple of things. First of all, before we get into the specialty element, I want to first introduce our guest host, Steve Somerville. Steve has been a very, very, very special person to us. I'm going to open up very, 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 very small, just how much he's made an impact for us. As a security company, a lot of what we do, focuses on dealing with people, okay? And training is a very big part of our piece here. And Steve was introduced into our lives, a couple of years ago. And a little bit about Steve. Steve was with the Toronto Police for 24 years and as a trainer. And he has trained over 15,000 police officers, COB College.
Yes, sir.
And on top of that, if that's not enough, Steve has also created a fantastic program called Stay Safe, which we have been utilizing amongst our team. And again, this is Steve today, guys. This is Steve. Thank you so much for
thank you.
Coming on as a host. And I'm going to push this towards you right now, Steve, to introduce our very special guest today.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Constantine. I'm excited about today, and I'm excited about this gentleman, this guest that's in front of us. And if I may, for a second, I'd like to just read something here. As a veteran emergency room physician, Dr. Brian Goldman has had a successful career setting broken bones, curing pneumonia, and otherwise pulling people back from the brink. He always believed that caring came naturally to a physician, but time, stress, errors, and heavy expectations left him wondering if he might not be the same caring doctor he thought he was at the beginning of his career. He wondered what kindness truly looks like in himself and in others. In the power of kindness, Goldman leaves the comfortable, familiar surroundings of the hospital in search of his own lost companion. And a top neuroscientist performs an MRI scan of his brain to see if he's hardwired for empathy. A researcher at Western University in Ontario tests his personality and makes a startling discovery. Goldman then circles the planet in search of the most empathic people alive to hear their stories and learn their secrets. He visits a boulevard in Brazil where he meets a woman who calls a homeless poet her soulmate and reunited with his family. A research lab in Kyoto, Japan, where he encounters a lifelike, empathetic android, and a nursing home in rural Pennsylvania where he meets a therapist who has an uncanny knack for knowing what's inside the hearts and minds of people with dementia, as well as her protege, a woman who talked a gun-wielding robber into walking away from his crime. The power of kindness takes us far away from the theater of medicine and into the world at large, investigating why kindness is so vital to our existence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Brian Goldman.
Hey.
This is, I had a chance to meet and talk with Dr. Goldman just before we came down here, and I had to make a little bit of a confession. I read, and over the last 4 decades of the industry where I wanted to keep my finger on the pulse, if you will, in terms of the requirements of making a person that can understand the needs of our community, this book changed my life.
Wow.
And as Constantine says, not being self-serving, I've had the blessing of training a number of men and women throughout this province, even at the Ontario Police College. And before that tenure, I wish I had read this book to give me a different snapshot into really the issue of empathy and caring, and it's beyond and above standard of care and duty of care. So thank you for the opportunity of this book. I was asked if I'd met you beforehand. I sort of said, I think so. I've seen you on news interviews, you checked out social media, and reading your book. I think so. And with your permission, sir, I've read a lot about you. And the people who are watching this podcast really needs to know about you and the journey that's caused you to be here for today. And if I may, I understand that the basis for this book was a result of being criticized by a patient, and specifically your treatment of a patient family member. Would you be able to share with us exactly what that was and what happened there, please?
Sure, Steve. This is something that happened about 25 years ago, and I was on duty in the emergency department, and I saw a woman who was brought to hospital by her family because she was at the end stage of a neurodegenerative disease, and she had reached the point where she required total care. She needed to be fed. She needed to be. She needed self-care. She couldn't move her arms. She couldn't speak for herself, and that meant that her kind and loving family was the filter for her. They were her voice, and I think at that time I was probably, I was certainly a lot younger. I was more defensive. I tended at that time, for a whole bunch of reasons that I guess I talk about in the book, to see the family members not as allies, but as pushy. And they had an agenda. They wanted her to be admitted to hospital because they felt they could no longer look after her at home. And even then, I wasn't at the beginning of my career at that time. I was no fool. I wasn't the kind of gunslinging emergency physician who would say, I'm not going to give you what you want if it's not appropriate. In fact, I made the referral to the internist for her to be admitted to hospital. But it took forever for her to be seen. And that's because she was not that ill. She needed full care, and her, she had reached the point in her life when she might have been entering a pre-terminal phase of her life. But she didn't have a fever. She didn't need to go to the intensive care unit. She wasn't dehydrated. They'd taken really good care of her. And you make the referral to the internal medicine team, and as often happens in the emergency department, from that point on until she was seen by the internist, the family would ask me one question after another. When will my mother get admitted to hospital? I don't know. Can you estimate when my mother will be admitted to hospital? When she sees the internal medicine team. And then the next set of questions, I'd go away and then I'd come back. I'd walk by the cubicle. When will my mother see the internal medicine team? And you have to understand that they have this thing called triage. They don't see people they see people one at a time, but if a sicker person comes in who has a life-threatening illness, they go to the top of the pile. And it must have taken 5 or 6 hours eventually for that woman to be seen by the internal medicine team. At one point, one of the family members raised a Spockian eyebrow and asked me, did you actually make the referral? With some doubt in her voice. And I did something that I don't usually do with patients. I snapped at the daughter. And I didn't yell at her. I said, I did what you asked. And I walked away.
You raised your voice.
I raised my voice, angrily. And long story short, she was eventually seen by the internal medicine team. She was admitted to hospital. She spent several weeks in hospital, and a short while after that, not unexpectedly, she passed away. After that, I received a beautifully handwritten letter from the husband, who I had met there, and along with other adult family members. And he invited me to come to a meeting with the family, and in order for me to meet, at least in an indirect way, the woman who had been my patient, to find out what kind of a mother she was, what kind of a wife she was, what kind of a grandmother, member of her community, what her likes and dislikes, what her interests were, all the things I couldn't have known. Well, I could have known if I'd asked, and that's another story. And also, and this was written quite pointedly in the letter, they wanted to talk to me to see if there was any residual kindness underneath all the brusqueness that I showed that day. And that letter hit me, it was like a stone. And there are many reasons for that. If you work in medicine long enough, if you work in the emergency department where you see strangers and it's episodic care, if you work long enough, eventually a few people are going to accuse you of incompetence. You know, you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what you're doing. There's a good chance that there, you know, when it comes to medicine, there are gray areas. So that you know, they've got somebody who has said Dr. Goldman was incompetent. There's a good chance that I can find a half a dozen other experts who'll say, nah, he was fine. You know, it's just circumstances, right? But when someone accuses you of unkindness, they've got you busted. You were unkind. You know, they experienced you as being unkind, and it hit me, and it set me on the journey you know, it was really, you know, really that was the bookend, the first event. The second event that set me on the journey was the night that my father died. And that was a night in which, you know, this was years later, now 7 years ago, almost 7 years ago next month. And he, you know, unlike this woman, I knew everything that had happened with my father. My father looked after my mother, who had Alzheimer's dementia. She died 11 months after he did. And he looked after her beautifully, kept her going at home longer than most, you know, long after a lot of other men in his position would have thrown in the towel. And I'll tell you that you know, I experienced with him the losses that he went through. The loss of his, you know, he had her eventually placed in a long-term care facility. And it was only when he was read the Riot Act, she developed shingles in her neck and stopped eating and drinking, and she was dehydrated within an inch of her life. And when she was admitted to hospital and rehydrated, the admitting team said, either you have a choice. You can either preside over her death at home quickly, soon, or she can live on in a long-term care facility. And I'll tell you that it broke his heart the day he had her placed in a long-term care facility. And 6 months after that, he had a heart attack. For the next 2.5 years, it was an awful existence for him, going in and out of heart failure, losing the ability to drive a car. We sold his house. He ended up in a retirement home. And the week before he died, I took him to visit my mom, and usually he could get a spark of recognition from her, and he couldn't. And I saw that look on his face that said, that's it, I'm done. And he died. And I will never forget being at the bedside just after he had died. We got this call at 2 o'clock in the morning and raced to the hospital. And I had been there with him until 10 o'clock at night. And I had done a night shift the night before. I'd been up for 42 hours, and I was blind with sleep deprivation. And when I went home, I remember taking a step to the door, and then looking back at my dad and walking back. He'd had chest pain. That was why he was in the hospital. And I took a step. You know, I walked back to my dad, and I bent over and I kissed him on the cheek, and I said, "I love you," for the one and only time in our lives. Because my dad, you know, we weren't a I love you kind of, you know, speaking kind of family. You know, he showed love by what he did, not by what he said.
Wow.
So we went home, and I don't remember my head hitting the pillow. I was that tired, but I do remember my partner Tamara shaking me awake, you know, calling my name slowly several times until I looked in her eyes. I opened my eyes and I said, "He's gone, isn't he?"
This is it.
Went back to the hospital. And I could see the discomfort on the young internist's face, thinking, and now I know what he was thinking. He was thinking, I got Brian Goldman's dad as my patient, and I couldn't keep him alive for one night. And you know, I could see his discomfort, his pain. His discomfort, that shame. It's not even pain. It's like I'm going to call him out and start yelling at him. He thinks I'm going to start yelling at him, and I'm thinking, I'm grieving my dad. You can go. And I actually said, thank you very much for looking after him. And it was really as I saw him and that defensiveness, that defensive posture that we have, that I recognized what I had been to that other family so many years before. So it was the two stories that sent me on the journey.
Is that what make you realize that?
Yeah, it was.
Wow.
It did. And you know, there were other things that were going on at that time that made me realize it.
Dr. Goldman, when you went to the family's home, what were you thinking driving up? I mean, because if we place ourselves in your position, it's a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
You probably, like, how much time passed between the request for you to go to you actually being there? How,
Few weeks, maybe.
So it's
you know,
enough.
it was after she had died, so that was about another 8 weeks later, probably another month after that.
Okay, so you could have easily found a way out of it, or talked your way out of it, or
Yeah.
which you might have tried to.
And you know, it's really interesting. I mean, I spoke to the chief of the emergency department. He offered to go with me, and I instinctively I knew they don't want a Politburo. They don't want to see a committee saying, you know what we do. In law enforcement, in the hospital, wherever, we did the best we could. Circumstances are, you know, we grieve with the family, we are sorry for your loss, and all that kind of stuff. They wanted to meet the guy, me, and I did, and it wasn't at their home. It was in a lounge in the emergency department, just off the emergency department, and it was me and a large number of members of the family, and
So a neutral place for your safety, I guess. Right?
No, it was it was in the emergency department. There was no escape for me.
Yeah.
I was going to hear what I was going to hear, and they said all kinds of things about the things that I missed and my attitude, and at the end of that, you know, they cried, I cried, and you know, there was a lightness at the end of that meeting, and that was the end of that meeting. And I'll tell you that we're going to talk about the journey of the book, but I'm going to tell you that just before COVID, just before the pandemic, I give lots of live presentations. I give lots of speeches in churches and synagogues and other places of worship, and lots of public lectures, lots of lectures to my colleagues, lots of workshops to my colleagues. And I was giving a speech in a synagogue in North Toronto, and it was going to start at 7 o'clock. People were starting to gather about 6:30, 6:40. This was in February of this year, and 3 people walk up to me, a distinguished older gentleman and 2 middle-aged people who are with them, probably their children. And one of them says, you remember us? And it took a few seconds, and I realized it was them. It was them.
Wow.
And we chatted. It was very amiable, very, very nice conversation, a warm conversation. They obviously felt comfortable. They saw me. You know what? I don't know. I guess they got this idea. I'd like to see Brian. He's going to speak about kindness. Why? And they said, they remembered to me that at the end of that conversation in which they dressed me down, they said that I said to them, "I'll never forget what you said." I don't remember saying that. Doesn't sound implausible, but I don't remember saying that. But I will tell you that I just looked at them and I said, "You have no idea what you're about to hear."
Can you share some of that inner dialogue? Because what's really cool, what you discuss in the book, is that empathy switch.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what that is, read the book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which I find, even for yourself, now that you in hindsight, you've been able to phrase it and share it, which is really cool, because it means we have the choice to be able to choose to be empathetic for the most part. What was that inner dialogue? What was it that, because you could have easily deflected it. You could have easily said or dismissed it, or they didn't understand the constraints on yourself. They don't know.
Yeah.
They don't understand. I'm an ER doctor, and you could have easily gave yourself a note.
That's right.
Why did you find yourself even being open to have the conversation?
They called out to my heart. They said, well, first of all, there was something about the letter that was, in spite of the pointedness, the brusque, the accusing me of brusqueness, they thought I was salvageable. I could read that in the letter, and I was interested in being salvaged. So I went.
Changed you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in the middle of a journey that I asked the book, in the book, am I a kind soul? And I think everybody needs to ask that once or twice in their lives when they're kind of mean to somebody, unnecessarily mean, just stuck it. You heard the commercial with the tagline, "Stick it," stick it to people. There's something, there's a lot of rage going on in the world right now. There's a lot, I'm going to stick it to this person, and that's not the only part of us. We also have this kind part, and we're constantly duking it out between the stick it to them side and that's not nice. I don't want, and you know, there was a spark of recognition that I learned about, and I talk about in the book, that you know, people tend to think of kindness as a win-lose proposition. If I'm going to stop to be kind to this patient as I walk out the emergency department when I'm exhausted, that it's going to take another piece out of my energy, out of my life force, so it's a net loss. They're going to get something from me and I'm going to lose something in the process. Well, that's not true. When I go on, you know, when I don't stick it to that person, but when I fail to acknowledge their distress at that moment, even just stop and say, you know what, I'll talk to you for a moment, I'm really exhausted. And I want you to just know that I'm exhausted right now. So you'll get a piece of me right now, but I am exhausted. But we don't like to do that because we're afraid we're supposed to be vulnerable, you know, invulnerable.
Yeah. Right. But permission to be human.
Permission to be human. We don't give ourselves permission, and that's something that I want to talk about. But I'll wait in a moment. The point I'm trying to make is that if I say I can't do that and I go, on the way home, my heart rate will go up, my blood pressure will go up, my distress will go up, and I'll be one step closer to burnout. And we tend, and so the point is that it's not a win-lose proposition. When you're mean to somebody else, they feel bad, you feel bad, physically and emotionally, spiritually. When you do the opposite, when you're kind to them, you feel good, they feel good. It's like this infinitely renewing resource for good and for well-being. Evolution has given us a capacity for kindness, and when we are kind and empathic, when we use those tools, we make the world a better place. And it makes sense because we wouldn't have built society without being kind to one another.
There's a children's book by Max Lucado. I know it because my kids love it, and it's shared in this light where everyone has a pail, and if you say something nice, something for their sake, you add nice things into their pail. You make fun of their nose or the way they walk, and you're taken out. And so my kids are amazing. They have full pails. So
that's great. And I also wanted to mention that when the family, so I gave the speech about kindness, and the first thing I talk about is that family. So when they said, you said you'd remember us, they had no idea how much I think about them and remember them.
Yeah.
And in fact, since that time, we've gotten back into each other's lives. Unfortunately, curtailed somewhat by COVID, but you know, not we're in each other's hearts. That's for sure.
Where I want to learn from you here today is you just created so many thoughts from what you said, especially resonating when my father passed 6 years ago, come out next month, and he was on life support.
Almost the same time as mine.
October 21, and I was hitting down. He was on life support down in London, so I had to make this drive from Durham region to get down there, realizing I was going to say goodbye to my father. I don't think he knew I was there. But the interesting point I just remembered after this was after he passed, I'm looking at these machines, trying to read them, is when a nurse said to me, he's gone, and a perfect stranger gave me a hug, right? And I don't get emotional. If I do, it's because of the air conditioning. That's going to be my commentary. But what a powerful tool of expression that I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't a clench. I didn't have to defend myself, and I was so vulnerable at the moment. I embraced that. You know, a perfect stranger did that to me. And you've answered questions. I've created some questions. Of course, that's my investigative nature. But this, if I may characterize, being criticized, it cut you to the quick. Why was that important to you at that moment of your career, at that moment of time? Like, had you ever been criticized before?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so why was this time, if I may ask, different?
Yeah, because, like, you know, I ask in the book, you know, am I a kind soul? And I think everybody, like, there's many reasons why people stop being kind or find that they aren't kind in a particular moment. And I explored that in the book. People who were kind, you know, people are kind for different reasons, out of a sense of loneliness, out of a sense of isolation, because they have some of them are, we're all hardwired. You know, it's interesting how often it comes from a source of pain. You're kind to other people, and you know, most people who have that much pain, and I certainly interviewed people who had, because of life circumstances, you know, either severe disappointment or pain or a sense of loss, that you can either be beaten down by that pain, or at the end of the day you can say, I will use that pain and draw some strength from it and be a source of inspiration to other people who have a similar, who are in similar circumstances. For me, I had a particularly unique source of pain, and that is that, like a lot of other health professionals, I am prone to shame. And I'm not talking about, you know, the helpful side of shame, you know, when somebody does something like drinking and driving, and they're shamed by the community, and it's hoped that you know, that shaming them can get them back on the path of doing what society, of being consistent with society, conforming to society. I'm talking about the Brené Brown type of toxic shame, where you feel that you are, that in the moment that you experience this, and it's a physical thing, and I talk about it in the book, tightness in my abdomen, you know, a hot feeling, blood pressure starts to go up and heart rate starts to go up. It's a total body reaction where I feel as if I am unworthy of love and acceptance, and, you know, by my peers, and I kind of wish that a hole would open up in the earth and swallow me up where I stand. And that comes, you know, the triggers for that typically in healthcare are being caught out making a mistake. And I think that you know, it's one of the reasons why health professionals tend to be perfectionistic. They tend to be judgmental of other people. They tend to see themselves as super people, supermen and superwomen, and they don't cut themselves any slack at all. Being human, you talk about, well, you're human, you said it. They're not human. They beat themselves up when they make a mistake or when they appear to be less than human. And that moment, and we don't, it's not just mistakes, it's faux pas. It's mispronouncing somebody's name. It's you know, like once in a room I referred to a patient with a mental health disorder by the slang term that I talked about in the book, The Secret Language of Doctors. And you know, it was a primitive part of my brain. I referred to them as using a kind of terminology that might be used by residents, might have been used by residents, and somebody criticized me in the meeting and said, you mean people with lived experience? And I felt shame when that happened. It was just it was a piece of discourse, but it was like the way that person did it. And I'm not blaming them. They are obviously very shame-based themselves. What they were doing was shaming me. Yeah. And
deliberately?
No, instinctively, almost instinctively. We do it to ourselves a lot. And I felt such a strong reaction to this. You know, from the first time I ever made a mistake in my life as a physician, you go through weeks and weeks and weeks of waking up at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, unable to sleep. And then, you know, it passes, you feel a little better, you're resolved to never make another mistake again until you make another mistake. I did a TED talk about that.
Yeah.
And you know, you reach the point where you either get beaten down by those mistakes, and I mean, some of my colleagues, you know, consider thoughts of self-harm after they've made a mistake. And you might say, you know, some people might say, well, good, they should feel that way, you know, but I don't think we really want people to feel that way. In fact, in the rest of the world, people learn from mistakes and they grow from mistakes. It's called failing forward. And you know, the idea that you never make a mistake because you're a health professional is absurd, but we do that. And I reached the point in my life where I thought, I can't go on like this. Door number one is avoiding mistakes, and door number two was not embracing them but learning from them and accepting that I'm human, forgiving myself. And you know, that's the last thing I write in the book. You have to forgive yourself if you want to forgive others. If you want to be kind to others, the first person you have to be kind to is yourself. And that self-nurturing part is not a big part of healthcare. It's not at all. And that's one of the key messages. You know, there's a reason why we're talking about rising rates of burnout amongst health professionals, because it's true.
If failing forward isn't part of the culture, have you seen it in your effort, whether it's intentional or just, you know, accidentally coming across it? have you been able to shape or reshape the culture so that the expectation is don't suffer in silence? There's at least some place that
Yes.
we can discuss it. Like how,
Yeah, I did that TED Talk and became a source of comfort or inspiration to colleagues who've made mistakes.
Reflective.
Yeah, they come to me because they know that they can feel safe talking about mistakes with me.
Because you don't judge them.
And being judgmental is a huge part of the shame-based personality. Judging other people, it's kind of a projecting the self-loathing onto other people by judging other people.
is there a healthy way for that to be facilitated where family has an experience in hospital? Okay, imagine, and in a constructive way, because I mean, maybe you lucked out that they weren't trying to crucify you. There was an element of intervention, giving you the information, however, but it I guess life came from it. Is there any formal way that families can submit their experience? Imagine they're 100% valid.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that it's more than it used to be. Certainly in hospitals, there's a lot of there's a movement to include patients and families, former patients, families of former patients, in dialogue with health professionals. To have, it's called patient and family-centered care. Part of that is to create a forum where mistakes can be discussed in a non-judgmental way. By the way, the airline industry does that. That's what the airline industry does. That's what crew resource management is all about. It's all about flattening the hierarchy and having and making it easier for everybody to talk about mistakes. But that requires a major change in culture. You have to have, not only must you have free dialogue, but the bystanders to the mistake have to stop shaming the person who made the mistake.
Yeah.
They have to. They can't. You have a lot of talk like, if I need this person to tell me that I did that wrong, that this junior person, for instance, this learner is going to tell me that I made a mistake. They'll actually say that. Then I shouldn't be in this room. I shouldn't have this position.
Well, we're seeing that being played out with policing right now, and defunding the police.
Right.
It's at a point where I guess people are not happy with how it is. So the only message that we hear, at least it's prevalent in the media, is shaming versus, and I kind of wanted to ask you that if you again, we might be going too quick, but forgive me if we want to curtail it back in any way. If for in some bizarre series of events, you had the 4 policemen that were part of the George Floyd arrest. You just, for some reason, you had access to them. You were in a room with them. And it wasn't for trial, and it was literally just for them. And it was a part of maybe the inception of a restorative program or whatever. What would you talk to them about? What would you share with them, with everything you've learned?
Well, the first thing I would do is not talk to them or talk at them. I'd listen. And I think I think we do a lot of talking and not enough listening. And you've heard the expression, why were we given 2 ears and 1 mouth? So because we should spend twice as much time listening as we do talking. And I think that what can you do at this point, for George Floyd and George Floyd's family, but learn from it, pay it forward by learning from it.
Just to jump onto what he's saying, for 12 years of my life, I taught at the Ontario Police College, representative of the Solicitor General's office. And ironically, we've compared a physician's assessment compared to a law enforcement's assessment. And we in law enforcement reference, quick cognitive processing. You got to make quick decisions. Blink. Malcolm Gladwell spoke about that in his book, Blink. And you hear something, you see something, and quickly you've got to form an opinion of a person. Whereas a physician, generally speaking, does a battery of tests, makes questions, is able to have the time, depending on, of course, on the nature of the medical challenge, to assess what you're going on. And it's the totality of the situation which drives law enforcement, generally in North America.
Right.
Not to be wordy, but one of the aspects, and I was recently at a coroner's inquest, and for purpose of the podcast, I won't mention the inquest, but a head trainer at the Ontario Police College was asked, how many times does the word empathy appear in the curriculum? His response was 0. Then how can you articulate under oath? Right. How can you articulate something that's relevant and important, yet you don't have it in the lesson plan? And there was really no answer for that. That was an epiphany of that inquest. Point being is when you're dealing with, jumping ahead a little bit, but when you're dealing with violent people or fear factor kicks in. And you mentioned about on the way home when your blood pressure's up or your heart rate's up, and you start behaving as a different human being at that point, out of your comfort zone. And when you're afraid, or dealing with a person that you're afraid, the whole issue of empathy can really, you may not be in a position or condition to be able to understand a person's trying to be empathetic towards you, and vice versa.
Right.
We always teach in our classes, and certainly at Sentinel, they mirror that in the training. When you're looking at a human being that's acting out, we'll leave it at that, what you have to ask yourself, is this person resisting you, or are they afraid?
Right.
Are they going through a challenge, a crisis? And what is the appropriate thing to say and help that person to ground their behaviors without having to lay your hands on another human being? It's a devastating decision. And law enforcement right now, I know you're going to say something, but law enforcement is being challenged now. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't, if I can say. You know, if there's some threat, a real threat that's preventing you from going home to the people you care about, what do the activists or what does a person with an agenda ask you or expect you to do?
Yeah, you've raised some really, really important points. You know, certainly as an outsider to that situation, you know, it occasionally happens, but it's rare, relatively rare, that I'm faced with a situation in the emergency department where there is a code white, exactly, a violent. That's the code for. I went through all the codes in my book, The Secret Language of Doctors, including Code Brown, which these days is known as an environmental emergency, but
we call that the fecal factor.
But that's right, a poop emergency.
That's right.
But it's rare that we have that we see a violent patient who needs to be brought under control to that where there is a real risk of endangering the public or endangering the people who are trying to get the situation under control. So let's start by saying that right away. But beyond that, there are remarkable similarities between the medical mind and the law enforcement officer's mind, in that we are all kind of propelled to think quickly and act quickly. And as you mentioned, you're talking about Malcolm Gladwell. There's also Daniel Pink, and there's fast thinking, slow thinking.
Yes. Great book.
We tend to operate in fast thinking mode, and I can tell you, just as in law enforcement, in medicine, we prize fast thinking. We tend to award the highest marks and the greatest accolades to the person who comes up with the answer first and fast. I know what to do. And in fact, we're trying to encourage more slow thinking. Why? Because I can't tell you about law enforcement. I can tell you in medicine, the faster we think, the more errors we make in diagnosis. The faster we think, the more mistakes we make. And we're trying to deliberately slow the process down through reflection and through teams where everybody on the team feels comfortable to make contributions to contributing observations to what they see, and asking questions like, what do you see with this situation right now? What makes you see that? What's the evidence that you see what you see? What else is there to see? And doing that, and it would be and that is part of what we call of what the airline industry calls crew resource management. They had their issues up until the 70s where lots of they felt that the accident rate among airliners, passenger jets was getting to the point where the public was going to decide not to fly anymore. Right. And so they changed it, and one of the things that they brought was they brought reporting of mistakes or reporting of situations that could lead to mistakes in a non-judgmental way, so no punishment, anonymous reporting. That was the first thing they did. We don't have that in healthcare. The second thing they did was flattening the hierarchy, empowering everybody, not just the cockpit crew, but the cabin crew and even passengers, to say, if you see, if you for instance see that you think you see flames on the wing, there's a good chance that the pilot can't see that because they're in the front of the plane. So you tell it, you say it to somebody. And the reason why that was brought in was, you probably heard about airliners that crashed because a navigator or a first officer was too deferential to the pilot and was afraid to speak up,
To say something.
we're heading towards a mountain.
Houston, we have a problem.
Now, and I could, certainly it works in healthcare, where the more people you bring on board making observations, and not just random observations like shooting from the hip, but saying what it is, what are the observations about the patient, their blood pressure, their demeanor, the beads of sweat, that makes you think that makes you see what you say you're seeing. Could you do the same thing in a high tension, a high stress situation where you have somebody who is a suspect, could be an assailant, could have a weapon, may not have a weapon, and I can't answer that, but I can tell you that many law enforcement organizations are looking at crew resource management as something they might be able to learn from, and we'll have to see.
Well, the issue of dealing with mental illness, emotionally disturbed persons, and now we have the crisis mobile teams.
Yep.
Certainly started in Hamilton with the COAST program and certainly morphed into Toronto. A brilliant opportunity to have a clinician at the scene to deal with mental health issues. It's not a question of the use of force application, it's the right verbal skills, it's the right empathy displayed in terms of your voice commands, and try to recognize the patterns of behavior that I could say certain as a clinician, not as a police officer, to make the situation become where I can get you back to healthcare, get you treatment, get you, and nobody gets hurt. That program is working, it's working effectively. And here's the thing that challenges me, and I'm challenging my own former profession. Why is it a clinician can do what I couldn't do in my former profession? But when you call my old business number 911, I'm the first guy or girl that goes. And I think the community as a whole, if I may say, are starting to ask those questions.
Yeah.
Are we out of our realm? Now, they talk about defunding the police. I won't get into that. It's another whole round of discussions. But when you have a clinician on board and you have got people that deal, you get somebody from CAMH or whatever, Michael Garrion Hospital runs that. You're dealing with people now that have the skill sets and the experience, relevant skill sets, experience to calm people at a crisis. And I suggest that is empathy. I suggest that is common sense and a trained skill that you're putting into practice where I don't have to turn to the fist to resolve it.
Fair enough, and I agree. But it also it's not just one of the things I talk about in the book is that it's not about selective empathy. I think there's empathy for law enforcement officers too.
Yes, sir.
And you can't say, I've heard colleagues talk about empathizing, they're kind to patients, and I see that they don't treat their colleagues nicely. And I'm thinking, you can't have it both ways. Empathy is empathy. It's indivisible. You're either empathic to everybody, you're either looking for commonalities with everybody, trying to imagine what it's like to be that law enforcement officer who has to make a quick judgment or somebody might get killed.
Oh yeah.
And if you're not able to do that, then you may be compromised in your ability or in the likelihood that the advice that you're going to give is going to be taken.
Nurture versus nature, something that we talked about. Are you born that way? Is everyone naturally empathic? Is it something that can be nurtured?
So the answer to that question is we are born with two dispositions. It's more complicated than that. But first of all, we are born with the pathways for kind of instant empathy, and we have brain cells that can do two things. They can walk and chew gum at the same time. It used to be that we thought there were brain cells that could chew gum and there were brain cells that walk. Or more specifically, there were brain cells that performed an action like playing a piano or typing at a computer, and then another set of brain cells that can watch another person, visual brain cells that are watching another person playing a piano. Now we know there are brain cells that do both, that can that light up when you're carrying out some action like playing a piano, and also light up when you're watching somebody else play a piano. And neuroscientists believe that those brain cells are part of our empathy circuitry.
Does everyone have that, sir?
Yes, we're all born with that, unless you are and there are certain areas of the brain that light up when you see somebody in distress, somebody in pain or somebody in emotional distress.
Why is that key, that synchronicity? Why is it?
Without it, we wouldn't give a darn if we were walking, running to the subway or running to our car because we have a very important appointment and we see a child sprawled in front of their tricycle crying. with some blood coming from a cut, and we wouldn't stop to help them. And if we didn't do that, that's a one-on-one thing. We wouldn't take care of our children. We wouldn't nurture our own children. We wouldn't nurture other kids in the neighborhood. We wouldn't build communities. We'd have killed each other eons ago.
A long time ago.
So anyway, that's one thing that we have.
Yeah.
But, I want you to understand, though, that's elemental, call it vanilla empathy. We also have these giant frontal lobes, and we have something called executive function. We are constantly weighing the cost of empathy, the cost of stopping to be kind, to stop that, to stop and help that child, versus the cost to my family, the cost to me. And I mean, there's studies that show that if
Are these polar opposites, you think?
no, they're not polar opposites. No, empathy is always a choice. At the highest levels of brain function, empathy is a choice. And we want to create the environment where you make the choice to be kind. But as has been written, there's a book called Against Empathy by Paul Bloom. And he makes the point that sometimes, well, first of all, our brains are organized to empathize with somebody who looks and talks like us. Is there a problem with that?
No.
Absolutely. Who are the most disadvantaged people right now with COVID-19? There's a good chance it's not people that look like you. It's people who maybe come from a different background, who are disadvantaged in a socioeconomic sense. So if you empathize with somebody who only looks like you, then that's a problem. Yeah.
Before we go to the, I know Steve, you referenced something like that. I'm not going to take the thunder there, but I know everyone right here probably is thinking, I'm thinking, I thought about it. I read your book, and my wife was, what book are you reading? I'm like, oh, it's this book, The Power of Kindness. And I'm like, you know what? I go, as I'm reading this, I think I'm a very empathetic person. I said to her, right? I go, do you think I'm empathetic? She goes, absolutely not. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? She goes, when I'm sick, you're saying just drink some water, you'll get over it, right? And I'm like, I do that, but it's funny just the perception, because in my mind, I would think I'm a very empathetic person and a very kind person, but when you're saying about just how it's a choice, right? It's also thinking like it's almost kind of gearing me to think more of the other person with it, because you don't think of that.
So what gets in the way of you being your kindest self? And there's a number of factors, but probably the number one factor by far is stress. If you're under stress, the best parts of your empathy circuitry are kind of overridden.
Right.
It's like a giant override. And if you're hungry, if you're tired, if you're sleep deprived, if you're not sure that you're going to be able to make your next rent, or your next mortgage payment, then that sucks empathy out of the room. Believe me, it sucks empathy out of your heart pretty quickly.
Okay.
I met a gentleman once who purposely arrived an hour early for any appointment, no matter how major or minor it was to his day, to be able to have random acts of kindness, because he didn't tell me exactly what happened, but at some point he wasn't afforded the time. He made a decision to go left versus right, and he always regrets it. Just because of the clock. So he said, I'm never going to be in that position. I'm going to always be, if needed, I can actually drive this lady who's at the bus stop in a blizzard, and I can take her 30 minutes out because I'm still going to be fine. Okay, and it's pretty amazing. He made provision in some way that he can choose to be empathetic and I guess not regret making that decision in a fleeting moment. So.
I don't mind saying this, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but I'd go on record saying that this book should be read by every use of force instructor in this province before you think you have the right or the privilege to stand in front of a room of people to tell them how they should act in a crisis. I offer that for the viewers' point.
That's kind of
I think we're getting, I'm telling you the straight goods, from a criticized, Constantine and I are laughing. I was having a chat with my family before I came here today, and we're talking about interviewing you. And over the years, I have been criticized for my harshness and the ability to shoot from the hip without thinking on the consequence. And there is a trainer that once told me that I remind him of a hammer, and everybody around me I treat like a nail. Yeah, you talk about a humbling moment in the epiphany. I'm thinking, oh.
So we both had a very similar experience there.
It's beyond embarrassing, but I think just for the purposes, we have a lot of healthcare staff and a lot of professionals in this room, but there's people watching this podcast may not understand two terms that we've used. Now, please ask you to put into terms what empathy is and why it might be different than sympathy. Is that fair?
Right. So let's do that. So let's start with sympathy. Sympathy is and you know the root is a synthesis, but it's not really. You know, the colloquial kind of the generally accepted definition of empathy is a gesture of concern, a superficial gesture of concern for somebody else without any kind of emotional investment in that person's distress. And you know, if you've ever thought about the times when you might write a sympathy card or extend sympathy to somebody who's suffered a grievous loss, loss of a parent, loss of a spouse, loss of a child, God forbid, losing a job, some major reversal in their lives, and you're thinking, if your first thought is, I don't know what to say at a time like that. I never know what to say at a funeral, at a shiva, at a visitation, and so we come up with stock phrases like "sorry for your loss," and that's just to get us past our own discomfort in that moment. Well, here's the thing about empathy: if you are dialed into your own discomfort at the moment that you're supposed to be extending empathy, it's awfully hard to extend empathy to somebody else. Because now I'll get to what empathy is. Empathy is the ability to imagine what it's like to be somebody else.
Put yourself in their shoes?
Put yourself in their shoes, and to have that at least inform what you do next. Not govern it, but inform it. Because remember, I said empathy is a choice. You can empathize with somebody and not have enough time to extend to help.
Yes.
So that, and what I'm referring to is cognitive empathy, to use your imagination. That is different from emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is actually feeling what the other person's feeling. And a mother who has that look of great pain on their faces, they watch their 3-year-old get stitches, their child is screaming. And by the way, it doesn't have to be like that. There's actually a hashtag, it doesn't have to hurt. Yeah. We can work on that a lot, but that's what we mean by emotional empathy. And we actually say that we want health professionals to have an abundance of cognitive empathy, but not emotional empathy, because imagine the orthopedic surgeon who can feel the postoperative pain of every one of her patients whose knees she's replaced. She'd probably quit that day if she could actually feel their pain. And so we don't want. You mentioned the off switch. There's that's a hypothesis of a neuroscientist that I interviewed, Christian Kaiser. He believes that surgeons have an effective off switch for empathy, that they can cut it off. And if you think about it, in the operating room, they need to, what they're doing is a form of controlled violence on a patient. Think about it.
Sure.
They would. Yes. It's probably worthwhile for them. I think we want our surgeons to detach themselves from the emotional import of what they're doing.
Yep.
I wouldn't want you impacted.
Exactly.
Because
you'd be trembling a little, maybe.
So that's another aspect of empathy, the emotional part of it. And then the third thing that I want to mention when it comes to empathy, cognitive empathy, the ability to imagine what it's like to be somebody else. What good is it for? It's only good if it leads to something, to the third aspect, which is emotional concern. The get up and go that makes me want to help somebody who's in distress. And we want law enforcement officers to run to danger, not away from danger. Firefighters to run to the fire. Right. Me, as an emergency physician, to run to the resuscitation room. And when I run the opposite way, or I walk slowly, and I start thinking nothing ever good happens when I go there, that's called burnout.
Yeah.
And how prevalent, I wonder, is that today in this world, COVID world? I would suggest that our first responders are pushed. I think healthcare is being tasked with more and more with less resources. I read what is put out there by the Interior Ministry of Labor with ONA, Ontario Nursing Association, talking about the level of violence in healthcare. And I've read a recent report where it says nurses are under attack and assaulted more in the workplace than corrections and policing combined.
Right.
I think the public's got to realize that. It's a war zone. It's horrible.
It's interesting, during the time, everything is affected by COVID, and it's going to continue to be that way. I would not be surprised if there are fewer incidents of violence against nurses during COVID, but there would be more instances of verbal abuse. You know, getting complaints from family members who can't join their loved ones in the in the emergency department or on the wards.
Yeah, I see.
Which I think has just been we're in this together. It's terrible. And add to that the fact that because this is a novel coronavirus, you have health professionals who for the first time feel the same danger that their patients feel. Wow. What I'm being exposed to at work, it could be brought on me or my family. And that's causing a lot of distress as well.
Can't get any more real than that.
No, that's right.
Don't. Which actually would lead me into a brilliant part of your book, chapter 2, and it's called Hardwired. And you talk about, you went to a medical center in Quebec. And there, sir, you went through a process where they actually assessed your hardwiring to be empathetic and kind.
Yep.
I'd like you, if you would, please tell us a little bit about that process, and what did that process tell you?
So I was a subject in an experiment in which I had an MRI of my brain so I was actually, you know, on the platform and wheeled into the MRI machine. If you've ever experienced it, it's very noisy. And I had ringing in my ears for months after that.
Wow.
It finally did go away. And in this experiment, they took a baseline scan of my brain. It's called a functional MRI, which means that it was actually measuring my brain activity. And so first of all, at baseline when I wasn't doing anything, and then they showed me in very rapid fire sequence images of people in distress, in pain. And I was given a joystick, and I could
Oxymoron by that word.
I could position the joystick, you know, the cursor. There was basically I had a computer control. The joystick was a computer control, and it was between two extremes, where I had to estimate how much distress was indicated by the photograph of the person, and on one side of a line, if you can imagine, a line between my two fingers, on one side no distress, on the other side maximum distress. And I had about 4 or 5 seconds between each image to make a judgment, position the cursor somewhere between no distress and maximum distress, and then hit the button and go on to the next image. And they were scanning my brain as they did that. So that was, and I was one subject in an experiment that had many subjects. So what they did was they took my results and summated them, like combined them with all the other subjects. And what they did was they compared a group of veteran health professionals on the one hand to people who had never worked a day in their lives in healthcare. And what they found was that the veteran health professionals on average had an empathic response to the people in distress, but less than the people who had never worked in healthcare. And that is a finding that has been replicated in a number of brain scan studies and other kinds of tests. And they don't know why, you know, they don't have an explanation. They have some hypotheses. They're at the stage of generating hypotheses. Why would I, in mid-career, as an emergency physician, a veteran emergency physician, begin to underestimate the distress of my patients? And, you know, one reason might be that for every image I saw, you know, I'm looking up because if I was wheeled into the MRI machine, the images were projected onto a mirror on the top of the tunnel, so that I could see them. They were within my sight lines. Why would I underestimate that distress that, say, you know, a lay person, a person who's never worked in healthcare, says they've got maximum 10 out of 10 distress, and I'm saying, nah, it's more like a 6. Why would I do that?
Is it normalcy? Just
well, it might experience. Well, that's
Yeah.
experience. Experience means that maybe I was instantly comparing that image with 9,000 other patients I've seen.
That's got to mean something.
Yeah.
Maybe I was thinking about the time that somebody was in a lot of distress, and it turned out they were just telling me a story.
Yeah.
Or maybe we live in a time of the opioid crisis, and maybe what I was doing was assuaging my incipient guilt for not giving them an opioid by underestimating their pain. You know, so that you know, if I said, yeah, that's a 10, then I might feel either I would feel compelled to give them an opioid or feel really bad in my heart if I couldn't give them one, because we have this opioid crisis. So that's another hypothesis that you could generate as well. But that was a finding, and so I'd like to say I wasn't unique. I'm one of a kind, and it's something that we need to. Does it mean that health professionals in mid-career are burned out? That's a possibility too.
And that would affect your perception?
Yep.
These results, are these pseudoscience, or is this the real deal?
Well, they're part of, as long as they are, now, if you get to the end of the book, as you know, and you have,
that's right.
I pushed Philip Jackson, the professor of psychology who brought me into the study and gave me the findings. He was very concerned that I was going to ask him, and I kept pushing him, does that scan say I'm an empathetic person?
Right.
And in the end,
drum roll.
Drum roll. He said, first of all, he said, this is what I was afraid of, Brian. Don't keep asking me, is this an empathy machine? And it's not. It's not. It's a piece of data. And he actually he gave me a very wise piece of advice, which took me back to the Wizard of Oz. You remember the Tin Man gets a heart.
Right.
And the Scarecrow gets a brain. Gets a what did he get?
He got a brain, didn't he?
He didn't get a brain.
Tin Man got a heart.
No, the Tin Man gets a heart.
Yeah. Scarecrow got a brain.
Scarecrow got a brain.
And the Cowardly Lion, courage.
Oh, he got a diploma. He got a diploma. That's right.
Yeah.
Scarecrow gets a diploma.
Yeah.
And then the Cowardly Lion gets an award of merit, an award of courage.
Yes.
That's it.
Well, each of them got something that they already had, an acknowledgement of something that they already had. So Philip Jackson says to me, why don't you ask somebody who knows you really well? So I asked my wife, Tamara, and she said, you're one of the kindest people I know. You're one of the most empathic people I know.
Were you satisfied with that?
In contrast to Constantine, I guess.
I know, better than
How good are we at gauging it?
No, you asked a great question. No, I wasn't. No, you know what? Because remember, empathy is a choice. Stress is real, and there are times when you slip back. And whenever I slip back, whammo. Wow.
You're human.
Thank you.
Are we good at gauging it ourselves, or?
I've gotten better at gauging it.
Yeah.
I've gotten better at gauging it. As I've gotten more comfortable, one of the things I've gotten really comfortable with is apologizing.
Sincerely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I get in trouble
There's no
for
other
apologizing when it's not sincere.
Because
Sorry.
Because remember I'm shame-based, shame-prone. So acknowledging that I've made a mistake, there's a price to pay for that. If you're shame-prone, you're inviting people to realize, oh, Goldman really is fallible.
Yeah.
And you know what? Because he talks about his mistakes more than everybody else in this room, we're invited to think he's more fallible than everybody else in this room.
Yeah.
Isn't that the way it goes?
So let me ask you this: because you can identify in your wife, and obviously that you are a kind, empathetic person, right? Do you find that people could take advantage of that?
Yeah, that's Paul Bloom in Against Empathy. That his argument in Against Empathy, and that's what everybody asks. Yeah, sure, people can take advantage of you.
Be conned, duped.
Yeah, do you what makes you judge that you can jaywalk? You're not supposed to jaywalk, but what makes people judge that? Their executive function says that they've calculated rates of speed and rates of cars and the gap, and they think they've got enough time, and they're. So my point is that you can be wrong.
Right.
You can be duped by somebody. One of the reasons why we're concerned about people with dementia being taken advantage of by con artists and by phishing scams is that they've lost that executive function that allows them to judge. But I'll tell you something at the same time. This is a real example. A famous cable provider who provides cable and email and internet and wireless to me and my family has never said anything about the spoof emails that drop into my inbox saying that my bill is ready to be paid. And on one of those occasions, about 3 or 4 months ago, I foolishly clicked on the link and found that my email account was hacked.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looked good.
Yeah.
I knew, afterwards I cursed myself. How could I have been so stupid to have fallen for that? Well, you can't keep your sensors on maximum all the time.
Right.
You can't keep your guard up constantly. There's a moment when you're tired, and I did it. And the fact is, we will be duped from time to time. But overall, I think if we're kind to others, the first thing you have to do is be kind to yourself. You have to get enough rest. You have to eat right. You have to exercise. And you have to take care of yourself. Nobody ever says take care of other people at your own expense. That's not what this is about.
But how common is that within your profession?
Oh, I think it's like the martyr complex, or taking care of others at your own expense. I think it's far too common. And you see a certain kind of health professional, entering middle age who's angry. They look angry, and they've come to think that their entire self-esteem is tied up in how much money they make, their income. And if they didn't get a fee increase, or it's all about the money that they're not making, and it's not that money's, yes, money can make you comfortable, but it's also it's a trap in terms of your own self-esteem. Basically, you want to do something because it's good for your heart.
Yeah.
Good for your soul, not just good for your pocketbook.
I was speaking with my mother-in-law yesterday. My father-in-law spent 13 months in hospital, had a brain tumor, ended up passing. It was a long time. Passed just over 11 years. The most amazing thing about it, his wife, my mother-in-law, strong Trinidadian woman, took the RT downtown from Scarborough every day for 13 months. Spent about 12 to 14 hours every single day. And her experiences and the ups and downs wasn't even necessarily related to the health of her husband, who eventually deceased. It was the experience of the clinical staff. The up and downs of from shift to shift. This nurse was nice this week, next week she wasn't. He was great, and she was great, and then he wasn't. The next one who would kind of come and take over. We don't bring it up much because it was a very tough road for her, but I spoke with her yesterday, and tears flowed again and kind of being brought back to the memory of the time. And what was actually pretty crazy when she was bringing back to memory what happened is the nurses over time started to respond to her care of her husband. And it, in a weird, bizarre way, it was an example to them what it meant to take care of somebody.
Yeah.
Okay. There were nurses who asked forgiveness of her. Okay, even doctors too, that in a moment were flippant or dismissive. She had doctors who directly said, your husband will be dead by Monday. And literally the exact words. And she said, it's in God's hands. Okay, and she kind of, for whatever reason, had grace, and she never let it upset her. After her husband passed, she wrote a letter to this hospital, and they brought her in front of a committee. And she's this little everyday lady who has never spoken in front of a group, and she doesn't even remember what happened, but she remembers that they basically apologized to her. Okay, as formally apologized, and they said, look, your example of love, we've never seen it. Your dedication, we've never seen it, and it's an example to us. You didn't have to say anything, you showed it day in, day out. Okay, that's amazing. But at the end, I had to actually apologize on the phone with her because it stirred up a lot. And she said, Mike, I got to get off the phone. Okay. And part of it was because it brought up memories of the neglect that her husband, the grade 4 bed sores that he had because they weren't giving him the physio. They had kind of lied about the mistakes that they've made. She naively asked a second and third opinion and got it verified several times that there was mistakes. And again, when I think about her experience, it's not standard, it's 13 months, but in some way it was very telling. Because if it's 13 hours, you don't know. You blow in and everyone's like, I got to get out of here. It became a home away from home for her because that's where her husband was. And she was able to, over a long term, just really get an idea of what happens here day to day. Okay? I had asked her in previous if she would be willing to kind of share that. And she said that she journaled everything. She journaled every day. But Like many people who journal, she kept it to herself. Okay. What would you say to her? She has 13 months of journals. Again, it's information. A lot of it is personal. To me, it would be a shame if no one ever heard it or just heard the heart of it. She had a chance to speak to the committee, but was intimidated by it. So never said anything and kind of just carried it for 11 years.
I would say to her that I admire her forbearance and her steadfastness to be at his side every day, that it took an incredible amount of courage and strength, and that is an example to be admired, and that I'm really sorry that she witnessed what she did, and that I wish things had gone better. At this point, she needs to be seen and heard. And I would hope that she would think that it's worthwhile to tell her story. But the most important thing is how she feels about it.
And if she said, okay, if she were here and said, how do I do that? How do I share it? How do I let this experience bring life to others? You know, that it would not just be in vain, it wouldn't be something that she had, but in some way would maybe change the culture or direct it, or, yeah.
I would say at this point, the most powerful thing that she could do, and it's just my opinion, I mean, take it for what it's worth, that and, a couple of bucks can buy you a small coffee. Yeah. I would say that if she could share that experience one at a time with another loved one currently at the bedside of somebody under similar circumstances. And there are people who go through this in the intensive care unit. There are people with COVID-19 right now somebody who, so that she could be a source of inspiration to family members or even patients who believe they are nobodies in the healthcare system. That somehow healthcare is all about this magic voodoo, complicated stuff, technologically complicated stuff. That is, and that the human factor is unimportant.
An institution.
Yeah. That the institution's more important than the individual. It's not. The institution is made up of patients and family members and hopefully working in tandem with healthcare providers. Certainly, I have no doubt that her experience would be a great comfort to other family members who are dealing with similar circumstances. At the very least, they would be able to say, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who's gone through this. And if she's really fortunate, then perhaps a nurse, a respiratory therapist, a personal support worker, a physician might learn from her story. And there are, I've certainly along the way, along my journey, as a broadcaster, we've had people on my radio show, White Coat Black Art, who have told their stories. And do they benefit? Do they find it cathartic or useful or educational to tell their story to Canadians, to people right across the country? I hope so.
Hopefully,
I hope so. At the very least, they unburden themselves.
Yes.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Today we were talking at around maybe 2 o'clock. We were going over your book, and you brought up something, Steve, in the book that I went over, which was really, I think it was on page 137 or 138. 138, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I read something in your book, Dr. Goldman. When I first read it, the physical response surprised me. I felt my shoulders tense. I raised them. I lowered them. I actually got up away from my desk, sat back, looked at the book, then I sat back down and read it again. I'd just like to read that out for a viewer's place. And this is in a chapter called Games of Empathy. And in it, sir, you wrote, and I quote, "Humans are hardwired to prefer those who share their skin color. If you meet a stranger with your same skin color, you see that person is likable, trustworthy, and sympathetic. If the stranger has a different skin color, You're more likely to think he or she is pushy, devious, and mean. You can't help yourself. Your brain makes those judgments automatically in about as much time as it takes to identify the stranger's skin color. And it goes on with more detail. Whenever I read, seldom do I ever have the opportunity to speak to the man or the woman who wrote it. Content, can you give me some context to that, please? What that means, and what should I think about myself after I read that?
Okay, so that, if you think of the two, think of the two kind of hardwired, instantaneous tendencies in our brains, in our primitive brains. One of them is to be empathic, but not that high level empathy where you arrange a bake sale or somebody's house burns to the ground and the neighborhood rallies and their family and this network develops that rallies to find them emergency shelter and find them clothing and toiletries and necessities of life so they can until they can get back on their feet, which requires a lot of executive function. No, we're talking about that, the empathy that you have, that is the vanilla empathy that I've talked about, that kind of instantaneous kind of low-level empathy. So that's one tendency that you have that's hardwired and baked into our DNA and in our brains. The other tendency is the one that you've talked about, the tendency in nanoseconds to recognize somebody else from gestures, photograph, from their skin color, from the way they talk, the way they dress, as either belonging to my group or to the other group. What the psychologists refer to, if they look like me, they are an in group, a member of the in group, my group. If they don't look like me, I make this decision that they belong to an out group. And so everything you've said about that is true. That's what research tells us, that we are positively predisposed to people who we think of as members of our tribe, our group, if you want to call it, and negatively predisposed to people who we think belong to the other group. Now, that is a basic, elemental gut reaction that we make.
Okay.
That is suppressed ordinarily by our executive function. Seconds after we have made that instantaneous, like our skin starts to crawl, we have that instant reaction. We think, oh no, that's not true. Even if I believe that, I'm not going to act that way. I'm going to cut other people slack. I'm going to look for commonalities. I'm going to, and so the thing you need to know is that ordinarily our executive function, our big brains that we've also been equipped with, suppresses that tendency to divide the world into us and them, except when we're under extreme stress. So, and that stress can be our fight or flight,
Right.
Our lives are in danger.
Yeah.
Or it could be more chronic, high-level stress from economic uncertainty, COVID, from work uncertainty, professional uncertainty, from housing insecurity, from food insecurity. And under those circumstances, our executive functions get suppressed, and we're back to this primitive us and them. And I talk about this a lot because in Canadian society, we're not where they are in the United States. But I have to say that in the United States right now, there's a lot of us and them talk, and they talk about building a wall and keeping the other outside the gates, and I think a lot of that, there's a reason why that thinking of us and them has been in ascendancy, and I think it's because that society is under a lot of stress, and it's something that we don't want to embrace. That's my personal opinion. I think it's something we want to avoid, and the way to avoid it is to paint a future that is promising, that is optimistic, not unrealistic, but optimistic, that is aiming to find the jobs of tomorrow and the enterprises of tomorrow, and deals with things like climate change instead of denying them, and tries to preserve the environment and preserve the universe, and nurtures people spiritually, as well as takes care of them. and leaves as few people behind as possible. If you have that kind of an environment, you dial down the stress, and a lot of the S&M talk tends to go away. But the important thing to remember is that we got both of those. We've got us and them, and we've got empathy, and it's partly a function of our circumstances, but it's also a function of our choice. Choose kind.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Makes me feel better.
Good.
When I read that, I thought, wow, like I've never considered myself racist or prejudiced or biased. That suggests that I was, right from my initial programming, but my ethics, my morals, my intellect, my training, if I understand it correctly, would certainly get me over that hump.
Yes, and I think it's important to remember that, why would evolution equip us with the instantaneous ability to decide that somebody's friend or foe? Because there was a time when we had foes.
Absolutely.
And there was a time when we didn't know if that group of people were going to kill us or be our friends.
Take us over.
Decisions could cost you your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just, there's a lot of great instincts that we have that helped us out, back when we were on the savannah and we had just dropped out of the trees, and are not so helpful in a so-called civilized society.
Definitely.
Nurture. I think about when we're discussing empathy, my clearest example of someone being empathetic wasn't myself. It was my 3-year-old. And we were driving downtown Toronto, and my daughter was quiet. She's almost never quiet in the car. It's Abigail. She's 11 now. She's always singing. Sometimes she's barking. She's everything. She's just an abundance of an imagination. And she was quiet. And out of nowhere, she just blurts out, "Why is that man sleeping on the ground?" In kind of broken, she might not even been 3. My wife would recall this better than myself.
Wow.
And that's, okay, so you turn down Snoop Dogg, okay, on the radio, and you say, okay, let's have a conversation. And my wife's amazing because she has that nurturing heart, and she started to kind of, instead of just a quick answer, or he made mistakes, or whatever, she kind of went in that he's a son of somebody. He might be even a brother to someone else.
Yep.
And he might even be a father.
Yep.
And I mean, pretty loaded words to a 3-year-old, but my wife said it in a way that she understood it. So we're driving, and we start to hear quiet tears. Okay? And these are like real 3-year-old tears. The opposite is the loud, obnoxious 3-year-old tears, right? So again, my wife says, "Abigail, what's wrong?" And she says, "I don't know, but I can feel what it's like to be alone like he is."
Oh, wow.
Okay?
Wow.
So emotional empathy. And I was just driving. I didn't, and to me, why that matters, because Abigail's 11 now, and if anyone meets her, she feels what other people feel. And I don't know if it was hardwired or it was nurtured, but she loves the most, innocent of all, which are just wildlife, because she can see that they just don't have a choice to live where we live. So she loves squirrels. Most people are like, "Get that black squirrel away from me." She's calling them over with peanuts. Bunnies have come in her hands, and she's just that kid. And my wife, if we dial it back, she could have just said, "Oh, whatever. He made mistakes, or he's alcoholic, he's probably on drugs. People like that, stay away from them." And who knows how those words would have shaped what she saw. Okay, and instead of, quiet tears, it could have been a calloused heart in a way, or just someone who said, they are not like me. So for me, that, I hope to have my own story one day.
Well, you do. I mean, that's her story is part of your story as well. And I think, I certainly met in doing research for the book, I met people whose empathy is off the charts.
Yeah.
And there was one particular story before I tell you the story, the idea that nurture is important, it's terribly important. And how much of Abigail's empathy for that homeless man came from a genetic or an inherited predisposition, and how much came from her mom, who painted a picture who caught her in the act of being empathic towards that man, and amplified it, and acknowledged it, and recognized it, and saw it. It may be enough. That may have been enough to fire up her empathy circuits, to tell her that this was a good thing to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And that may be the reason. That, you know, it so happens that when I was in Brazil, I met a young woman who befriended a man who had been homeless on the streets of Sao Paulo for about 37 years, the last 19 in a particular part of town not far from the University of Sao Paulo. And this woman, you know, treated this man as a human being, and discovered he was a poet, and read one of his poems, and discovered that he had 10,000 poems written on small pieces of paper in his makeshift tent, and created instead of dreading him, made a Facebook page for him. She was a marketing guru, and turned him into a local celebrity, and eventually his family of origin reached out and said, "I think that's our Raimundo," and he was, and she helped reunite him with his family. Fast forward, and a couple of years later, she has a son, Tata, and by the time he's a toddler, he adopts his own homeless man on his own, because he could not possibly. He was not aware. He wasn't alive. He hadn't been born when Shala, the woman, had made contact with this man who was homeless, who had lived on the streets, and he was empathic. Now, was he empathic because his mom's nature was to be empathic, or her nurture was empathic? Possibly. But it certainly is an intriguing possibility, and certainly the neuroscientists that I spoke to, that I interviewed for the book, think that there are people, that like all things, intelligence and intuition and kindness, that every personality trait is on a bell curve. That there's some people who are exceptional, and most of us are in the middle, and maybe Shala and her son Tata are both exceptional, and maybe that's for genetic reasons. It certainly, leads to some engaging speculation.
Yeah.
No, that's good. So what we're going to do is, in a little bit, we're gonna throw some questions out to the floor. But before we do that, and I know Steve, in discussions, has read the book a few times, and also I know there's a little update that you need to share that you said for a 2020 update.
Yeah, no, the 2020 update is the one that I told you about. It's the one that the family that started me on this journey.
Okay.
And they were, they thought that I would, when I said I'd never forget them, I wasn't, I didn't realize that it would sit with me and would fester and would spark a curiosity about kindness. That really took the death of my own father for me to understand that was the moment when I finally understood what it was like to be them.
Yes.
But for them to realize that I had actually taken the message to heart. A quarter of a century later, yes. There they were, and kind of completed the circle. I guess that was my opportunity to give something back to them, because all they wanted was to have their own pain acknowledged,
right.
and to know that I was affected, and that I wasn't simply impervious, like water off a duck's back, that I was affected by them, and they saw that I was.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
We saw each other. That's what we want.
Yeah.
That's what, as humans, we
awesome.
crave
Yeah.
to see and be seen.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. No, for sure. Before we do get to the questions, Steve, I'm going to throw it to you. Because,
thank you.
I know.
Thank you, Constantine.
Yeah.
It's interesting, sir. When I usually read a book, or listen to a live speaker, it's usually the first few words and the closing words that resonate with me most. And I read all aspects of your book, and I take you to the final chapter called Epiphany. And there is, for those who are watching this podcast, here's how you caught my attention, sir. This is what you said. If you want to be kind to others, the first person you must be kind to is you. If you want to connect with others, the first person you must connect with is you. I believe that most of us have one kind of pain or another tucked away in a corner of our hearts. Denying or running away from it won't make you feel better, but it will make it harder to connect with others. If you can take a risk and embrace your flaws, or you might see as your less than perfect side. Christian Kaisers, the researcher who helped discover mirror neurons in the brain, taught me that humans are hardwired to be empathetic and kind. But he also taught me that empathy is not a biological obligation, but a choice made by weighing pros and cons. The choice is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Brian Goldman. Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if we can just have the house lights put on. Right now we'd like to open up the floor. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Goldman, please ask away. And everyone was given a little number as they entered today.
I think we should let Dr. Goldman choose that number
Absolutely,
between
1 and 15.
1 and 15.
And the lucky winner will win a Dr. Brian's latest book, The Power of Kindness, and he's going to autograph it, I'm assuming.
I will be happy to.
Okay.
Do you want me to choose a number?
Yeah, let's do it. 1
Okay.
to 15.
Lucky number 7.
Who's that?
Who's number 7? Oh,
Oh, wow.
okay.
Hold on, some people
wow.
are checking their numbers now.
Yeah, double
Yeah.
check. Going once, going
Right.
twice?
Yep,
No?
going once, going twice.
Okay, there's another one.
Go. Let's go.
13.
That's my lucky number.
Okay.
No.
This is the book that doesn't want to be given away.
Say 5.
Healthcare guy, no kidding, right?
You want to choose one more?
Yeah, one more.
Okay.
Sure.
3.
Yay!
There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Right at the end, we'll
hilarious.
get Dr. Goldman to sign that up for you. Good read.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, please throw it out. We'll have it set up to you.
Okay, yeah. In the back.
Right in the back.
My question would be basically, is there a way of creating clinical treatment to allow people to grow their empathetic nature? There was a study done basically where they allowed children and at first rats the ability to have small amounts of empathy in terms of nurture in childhood. Left with absolutely no nurture, they all died. So on some level, empathy must be part of our life force. And thus, if you had a particularly traumatic childhood, or if you were raised in a home where nurture was not provided, is there a way to kind of implement in the Western clinical world that emotional side of development?
That's a great question, and I think that there are certainly have been many attempts to develop treatments, and there is a chemical that is very important in childbirth. It's called oxytocin. It's also very important in breastfeeding, and it turns out that it's a kindness chemical. And there are actually studies in which people who were born as sociopaths or psychopaths, these are people who are cold-hearted, are given as a nasal spray oxytocin, and it is possible that they increase the tendency of that person to be empathic. I'm not recommending that people go out and get
Flying off the shelves now.
be flying. Well, not everybody
No, I
values
know.
kindness. That's
I know.
that's an interesting point.
Wow.
If there was an instant treatment, would everybody want it?
It's true.
The other side of this is can you teach empathy? And certainly one of the world's experts on that subject, Mary Gordon, who developed a remarkable school-based program called Roots of Empathy. So this is a program that was designed to address schoolyard violence and bullying, and the way it works is that in an age-appropriate way, Roots of Empathy can be given to students anywhere from grade 1 to grade 8, and basically it's 27 sessions. And the highlight is every third week, the children, the students get to sit on the floor, and in walks a couple, and they bring their baby starting at 5 months of age, and what the students are able to do is observe a baby, a pre-verbal baby, growing and developing in the context of a secure and attached relationship. And they're not looking for rock stars, they're not looking for the most empathic people on the planet, or CEOs or highly successful people. What they're looking for are people who just get, loving attachment of their children. And it's an observation-based program where the students are able to make observations about what the baby might be feeling by their gestures, and if they cry. The facilitator is trained to not judge what they're doing, what they're observing, but to simply accept it with gratitude. And slowly but surely, a number of things happen. First of all, with many observations made by the class, there, in the pre-COVID days, there might have been 15, 20, 25, even 30 students, and it's like a team, through a team of students, through that process, each hearing other theories of why that child might be crying, or why the child laughed or smiled or cooed, cuddled. They're learning to wonder what it's like to be that baby, and what the baby might be feeling and thinking. And Mary Gordon, who created the program, and this program has been very effective at reducing schoolyard bullying and violence. She does not believe that the program teaches empathy. She believes that what it does is it catches students in the act of making an empathic observation. So it's like a muscle memory. It helps to develop your pre-existing circuitry for empathy. And keep in mind that some of these students come from homes where there was domestic violence and pain and suffering and strife. And so they may have come from homes where they never observed empathy in the context of a loving and attached relationship. Even in those homes, they can learn something and grow up into teachers, into people who do not repeat the cycle of violence in their own families because they've learned the value of being empathic. I think that that's something that is possible. I also think that you mentioned people who have traumas, and I think we need to pay our society and the healthcare system needs to pay particular attention to people who have who come from backgrounds where they were traumatized, and by emotionally, physically, sexually, whatever, they're all bad, and help them find ways of feeling better, of venting what they feel, and finding constructive ways of dealing with their feelings, and if and when that happens, they learn to be empathic, because it's your natural tendency to be empathic. That we're hardwired to be empathic. We really are, and if we take the stress away, if we take the strife away, the pain, then people can learn to be, can rediscover their own capacity for empathy. But that's not to blame people who find it challenging to be empathic, because there are some people who have gone through horrors, and my heart goes out to people who are suffering from PTSD because of things that have happened in their childhood, or indeed first responders, law enforcement officers, paramedics, for instance, who have witnessed and seen and had to act in very, very trying, traumatic circumstances. And sometimes there's pain that is very, very difficult to heal.
Very nice.
Well,
Questions? Kat?
Okay. Sorry, my question was going to be based on what you just spoke about, the teaching and something that you can learn from this, and trying to link everything together. And you're saying that empathy is a choice, and we have our vanilla type that is present with everybody, as well as an executive brain that should be able to neutralize those instinctive feelings, right, that we're kind of born with.
Got it.
That means that who you guys are talking about is nurturing as well as experience, right? If that is the case, and speaking like from what the answer you gave us about some of the lessons being taught, and just agreeing with what Steve was saying in terms of, like, you know, in his previous profession, that book, everybody should be reading it, right? It seems like there's tests being made, so if there is a link to that, and if we can nurture and provide good experiences for people to make the positive choices in light of the climate of what's going on around the world today, what is the pushback for having these kinds of lessons put into schools? Or in the teachers' college to teach teachers to be able to have lesson plans for kids so that they can experience this right from the get-go.
So, you know, there are roots of empathy. At the time that I wrote the book, it was in probably 12 or 13 countries. That's expanding. 1 million children. At the time, 1 million children had gone through the Roots of Empathy program. There are how many people on the planet? 6 billion, 7 billion people.
Yeah, 7
so there's there's a long way to go to cover the planet. Where's the pushback? I think the pushback comes from a number of things. It might come from cost. It might come from people saying that we can't afford to be empathic. You have to make the case that you can't afford to not be empathic, that it's making the world a worse place, that not having empathy is a bad thing for the world. You have to convince people. There is something seductive about being able to blame other people for our troubles. To say that it's people who are, you know, it's the other who's responsible for the fact that I don't have a job right now. And there are some very real problems. There are people who don't have work right now. COVID has certainly accelerated that problem. There are people who don't have adequate housing. You know, if I came from a disadvantaged background right now, if I came from a racialized background right now, I would be so angry that the people who are getting COVID-19 and are more likely to die of it come from disadvantaged backgrounds and backgrounds where people aren't getting a proper break. And you know, I think as a society we need to address that. And at the same time, you've got other people who are saying, no, we can't afford it. You know, we just can't afford to do that. I think we can't afford not to, but so that's the pushback, unfortunately. It's seductive, and I think it's like a pendulum swinging back and forth between more empathic and more us versus them, more empathic, more us versus them, and I'm hoping that, you know, maybe this crisis is going to galvanize us. But you know, if you look in the United States, there's a reason why Donald Trump has been popular.
Yes.
And you know, people who are looking at the outrageous things that he says and does are missing the point.
It is what it is.
It's not, I wouldn't just say that. I would say it's not about Trump. It's about the people who are voting for him.
Absolutely.
It's about the people that are going to his rallies. And ask the question, why are they going to do his rallies? And you know, if there's a failure to articulate a more hopeful, you know, to make the case for empathy, to make the case for caring for one another, then it's not just on him, it's on them for failing to make that message.
Yeah.
Well put.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, at the back. There's lots. Yeah,
Chris
got a
in the
couple.
back.
Can't see you.
Chris.
One of the things that you mentioned was that, you know, before you can be empathic to others, you must first be able to be empathic to yourself, connect with yourself.
Right.
I'm sure you imagine that's very difficult for a lot of people who fall into patterns, and as a result of those patterns, kind of neglect themselves and neglect, many aspects of, you know, as you mentioned, what matters to the heart and to the soul. Just what advice would you give to help people who have fallen into those patterns where they are neglecting themselves in that regard?
It's complicated, and I don't want to make it simplistic. But you know, the simple thing. I mean, you can only do for yourself what you can do for yourself. You can't change all of society. I'll talk about society in just a second. But one thing you can do, certainly, try to take care of your body. That means eating right, eating, you know, variety of fruits and vegetables, and you know, proper nutrition, and not so much fast food, and you know, overly refined food, overly processed food. Getting exercise, you know, whether it's riding a bike or walking, getting out into nature, seeing things that are beautiful to look at. And not everything that's beautiful to look at costs money. You know, I run 3 times a week, 3 or 4 times a week, 8 or 9 or 10K. And the reason why I do that is that I only feel right after I've run. A lot of the rest of the time, because of COVID, I feel tense and anxious. So I recognize that. Meditating or finding that, finding that place where you can kind of shut out, the strife and the news that's kind of pouring in and making us kind of feel like we're inundated with bad news. Staying off screens for a while. Staying off television screens and computer screens and smartphones and tablets, that kind of thing. So those are the kinds of things you can do for yourself. And then the other thing you can do is look in the mirror and forgive yourself for the mistakes you've made. Forgive yourself. Ask others for forgiveness. Strive to do better, but cut yourself some slack. Those are the kinds of individual things you can do. On a society level, there's no question that there are some remarkable studies that have linked people who either drink too much, smoke too much, or eat too much of the wrong foods. All of those are addictive behaviors: sugar, salt, tobacco, other drugs, alcohol. They have one common factor, and that is early childhood trauma.
Wow.
It's remarkable. And as a society, that's the kind of thing we need to take care of. We need to do a better job of taking care of. And that's not on the people who have undergone that stress to fix themselves. I know we have this attitude that we tend to reward people for taking care of themselves, and sometimes we think it's a negative cost to society to take care of, to make a decision to leave no one behind or leave as few people behind as possible. I think that's a mistake. But that's on society, but the rest is on us individually.
Good.
Yeah, Craig?
So, kind of speaking from the healthcare environment, from I go here in hospital myself, I've been there for almost soon to be 20 years. From the protection services background, watching how we've evolved through the healthcare field, we have discovered things like emotional intelligence training, and we've been long seeking a just culture environment to address that issue of shaming and improve and reduce mistakes. One of the things that we've experienced is how that kind of shame and either overly empathetic or lacking empathy response by healthcare workers often triggers violence in the workplace, triggers unwelcome responses from our clients or from our own colleagues. One thing is, as we progress and we're building a new building and we see we're installing more and more technology, more and more systems, more and more things that perhaps are taking our clinicians away from the bedside as much as perhaps that used to be. What impact do you think technology right now is having on our ability to share empathy with others in constructive ways, and to find the time especially in this industry where we love process and we love flow and everything has to go a certain direction? What impact do you think technology is having on that as we move forward, and how do we overcome that to maintain that human touch in healthcare that's so, I think, critical to good outcomes?
On a fundamental level, technology is neutral. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. There are certainly examples in which technology is beneficial. During COVID-19, I think that virtual healthcare is something that was long overdue. I during the summer for White Coat Black Art, I visited the county of Renfrew in the Ottawa Valley. It encompasses northern communities, remote communities, the Ottawa Valley, Algonquin Park, some indigenous communities, and they created there. They were terrified, because this is a sparsely populated part of Ontario, 130,000 people living there. Something like 20 to 30,000 don't have a family doctor, or if they do have a family doctor, they're part of a roster of 5,000 patients, and that kind of tells you that their chances of getting a quick appointment are slim to none. And they were terrified during COVID-19 that you had a lot of seniors who were isolated, who couldn't drive a car, and there's no public transportation, there's no rapid transit, there's no bus service where they live. Either they get a taxi to drive 40 kilometers, which is probably not going to happen, or they're going to have to call 911. And the authorities were very much concerned that they were going to be, the hospitals would be inundated with 911 calls, with people coming to the emergency department, perhaps needing admission to hospital at a time when they needed to reserve beds for people with COVID-19. So they created this virtual triage assessment center, or VTAC, and instead of calling 911, you called a toll-free number, spoke to a receptionist on the phone, who would arrange for you to have a quick virtual appointment with a family physician or a nurse practitioner. And that person would do an assessment. If they could, if they could figure out what you needed virtually, they would do it. If they thought you needed a house call, they would dispatch paramedics, community paramedics, not first responders to emergency, but paramedics who come in specially equipped vehicles, who could put IVs in if they had to, could do blood work, to do electrocardiograms, could do a bedside ultrasound to see if you had blood in your belly, or if you had a punctured lung, or a fracture for that matter, which you can all of which you can do on ultrasound. And that program has been remarkably successful, aided and abetted by technology. Without the technology, that kind of a program would probably not be possible. So that's the good. The bad? Smartphones. Put smartphones in the hands of the vast majority of teenagers, and you have rising rates of anxiety.
Wow.
You have kids who are measuring their self-esteem by the number of likes they have, and not by having those deep, meaningful conversations with friends who are part of a lifelong peer group. Do you remember having friends that you met when you were kids, where you didn't see them for 5 years, and then you'd see them and it was just like old times?
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that our brains are hardwired to develop. And when we don't have those opportunities, then you have rising rates of depression and anxiety among high school kids and college age kids. And I don't know if you've noticed, but not every teenager is looking forward to going back to school. A lot of them are terrified, almost phobic, that they're going to die from encounters that they have at school because of COVID-19. Wow. So there you have two examples right there. What do I think of technology? It's neutral. Sometimes it's a force for good, and sometimes it isn't. And it's up to us to know the difference and to evaluate how technology is used to decide, whether it's something we want to have or not.
Very nice. We have time for one more question, so I'm going to let you choose.
I need a hand.
Right here.
Right in front.
Okay, go for it.
It's hard to like.
How do you feel that someone's profession? How do you think someone's profession affects the type of person that they are?
And so how does somebody's profession affect their capacity for empathy, their capacity for kindness? Certainly, if you look at my own field of medicine, it's really interesting. There is a scale that's called the Jefferson Scale of Physician Empathy. It was developed by Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and it is researchers at Thomas Jefferson University. It is a 20-point scale that the higher it is, the higher your level of empathy as evaluated by other people, not by you. And different specialists have different levels of empathy. It turns out that primary care physicians, so family doctors, general internists, emergency physicians tend to have fairly high levels of empathy. Nice to know. Except ones that are in mid-career. Remember, it's complicated. And the lowest level of empathy tends to be in radiologists and cardiovascular surgeons, people who fix broken hearts, which is ironic, and neurosurgeons. And now, that's more of a coffee table, like small talk. It's kind of popular wisdom. It's something that you can you can have a little bit of fun with. Psychiatrists tend to have very high levels of empathy, even though some people don't agree. The point is that though these differences exist, and men tend to have less empathy than women, that's just small talk. Empathy is on a bell curve, and you can have exceptionally empathic neurosurgeons just as you can have cold and rather unempathetic family doctors and psychiatrists too. But yeah, there are people who gravitate to certain jobs because they, maybe because they are excited by the puzzle of finding a solution and not so much helping other people. And I'll tell you frankly, we have in medicine right now a lack of geriatricians, a lack of people who adore looking after seniors. And that's because we have attracted people who want to mend broken hearts and fix broken bones and take blood clots out of brains and take brain tumors out, which we need, but we don't have enough people who just love managing chronic illnesses in seniors and people with dementia, people with who have heart failure and kidney failure and lung disease. And I think in medicine we have to do a better job of recruiting the people who are in our healthcare system who need services and who aren't being well looked after. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's good. The only reason why I asked because being empathetic is obviously very important in any profession. So I just wanted to know how that's why I asked that question.
I think you're right. I think empathy is terribly important for all of us. But it's in radiology, for instance, solving the puzzle. So looking at the picture and figuring out what's wrong with that picture, that's an important skill set. But it's interesting that as radiologists start to do more direct patient care, there's something called interventional radiology, where they're actually doing procedures like putting tubes into your kidneys to drain off the urine because the ureter is blocked, or other kinds of procedures that they're having much more direct patient care. And so the next generation of radiologists has to have more empathy. Also, another interesting thing is that with deep learning, artificial intelligence, we're very soon, within the next 5 years, we're going to have computers that can do a better job of reading CAT scans and MRIs than human beings.
Wow.
And we won't need as many radiologists, so we better get with the program and develop our human skills.
Maybe we'll need more huggers, just like Steve's saying. I wanted to say in closing, I've never asked myself, as you did in the beginning of your book, if I'm kind. I don't think I've ever asked myself if I'm kind. 3 hours ago, Steve had asked me, are you empathetic? Do you believe you're kind? And it's just, I don't know why it's not a question it's just something that we don't talk about, whether you're in a circle of alpha males or just with emotionally balanced women that are chastising you, okay? And I think we talk about love, right? We measure ourselves. Love is like a currency. You're like, oh, I love my wife. I wouldn't do that. But were we kind? Could we be kinder? And I think what's amazing about the title of your book, that it is truly a power. There is truly a power. It reminds me of, there's a couple that I know, a really great couple, and it was about 20 years ago. The bride, when she was getting fitted for her wedding dress, was having a very bizarre experience with the lady who was fitting her. Being very curt with her, very rude, and the bride-to-be who was being fitted in her dress for her wedding, instead of being judgmental or saying, I'm paying, maybe $2,000 for this dress, decided to be empathetic. And she asked her, and she said, hey, don't worry about my dress. And she asked her to stand up, and she said, are you okay? How are you doing? And the lady who was pinning her wedding dress said, I'm sorry, I just found out I got cancer. Okay. To me, stories like that, I think it's because we live such busy, stressful lives, we don't ask those things. We don't, even if we see it right in front of us, that person saw you and that, can I just give you a hug? We see the barista in a coffee shop under stress. You just don't know what they're going through. You see a lady pulling 3 kids in the subway and you think, why isn't she keeping them quiet? Okay, you don't know what they have just found out or what they might have just lost. And I think that's true power, is that it's that armchair quarterback where, you know, critiquing someone else, saying, oh, I would have done this, or look at them, and because we know better. I mean, if anything, my takeaway from all this is just thinking how I can, you know, use who I am as a person and be kind in small moments. Slow down a little bit and just ask someone how they're doing. Maybe it could change their life, you know. So.
Oh, that's awesome. That's good, man.
Yeah.
Dr. Goldman, thank you so much for coming down today. We've learned a lot. For everyone and anyone, The Power of Kindness, find it in your bookstore right now. And we want to thank you very much. Again, a round of applause for Dr. Goldman.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Goldman shared that the audiobook was just recorded.
Yes, the audiobook. Yes. In a British accent.
Right?
No.
Do you know when that's coming out, the audiobook, for those
It should be coming out in the next 2 months. It's being published by ECW Press, and so you'll be able to click and buy it. And and now it'll be a companion on your long walks and cycling and
your car drives. Plug it in, listen to something relevant.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Well, again, thank you very much, thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you for your
Have a great night.
This podcast is brought to you by Executive Protection Lifestyle Canada. Make sure to drop by next week and don't forget to subscribe.